evening. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's going to go. First off, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times while at this event. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Jeanna will be signing and personalizing books at the desk behind me near the side door. We, of course, also have additional books available for purchase tonight. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Heretic online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so with all that in mind, we are very excited to introduce Jeanna Kadlec and Maud Newton, who are here celebrating the release of Jeanna's debut memoir, Heretic. This year has been so full of incredible debut memoirs, Maud's included, which is also available tonight. And Heretic is phenomenal. The writing is sharp, funny, thought-provoking, and precise, and the story, of course, is all the more captivating. Needless to say, we can't wait to hear what more Jeanna has to say about this fantastic book tonight. Jeanna Kadlec is a writer, astrologer, former lingerie boutique owner, and recovering academic. Her writing has appeared in Elle, Nylon, O, the Oprah magazine, Allure, Catapult, Literary Hub, Autostraddle, and more. A born and bred Midwesterner, she now lives here in Brooklyn. As I mentioned before, Maud Newton joins Jeanna in conversation tonight. Maud has written for the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, and Oxford American. She grew up in Miami and graduated from the University of Florida with degrees in English and law. All right, that's all from me. Without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Jeanna and Maud.
Thank you so much for that introduction. All of your beautiful faces are killing me. I'm going to cry. Also, I really love how gay Mauds in my shoes are. Very, very gay evening we're about to have here. So I am going to read from the very last bit of the book. I have been reading from other parts of the book, but I realized that this is such a celebratory day and evening, and I don't want to read about my trauma. So what do y'all think if we just read about some queer joy? We're going to do that tonight. The joy of the Lord was talked about a lot in church, namely the continual exhortation that the joy of the Lord is my strength, that the comfort that comes from knowing and trusting God is a source of strength. So too is there much talk of the freedom that comes from knowing Christ Jesus, purportedly freedom from the sin you are constantly repenting from. Today, there's another kind of joy that gets talked about a lot in my friend circles, queer joy. Queer joy is different from the joy I grew up with, the kind that is emblazoned with Christmas colors on holiday towels. The Latin root of joy is gaudere, to rejoice. Joy is not simply a feeling one settles into, like a warm blanket. It is active, perpetual movement, a state of being that is cultivated with others. I want to attempt toward joy, Ashen T. Crawley writes. Queerness isn't just a sexuality. It's a way of life that requires active and intentional daily work to decenter the normative and recenter our community, our safety, and our joy. Queer joy is not hierarchical. Queerness is the freedom to belong to yourself and others without societal restriction, without the bonds of natal family, hierarchy, and the state pressing on you. Queerness's ecstatic and horizontal temporality, is a path and a movement toward a greater openness in the world, Jose Esteban Munoz writes. Queerness is getting to invent the communal structures that best serve your beloveds in real time. Queer joy is found in Audre Lorde's Erotic. Queer joy is waking up with the woman I love and going to meet friends for a picnic in Prospect Park or on a rooftop without any obligation to church or institution or blood family. Queer joy is listing each other as our emergency contacts, showing up when crisis plunges our beloveds into homelessness and health emergencies. Queer joy is found in my all-queer D&D games, in the explicit, collective commitment to decentering and deprioritizing cishet men and heteronormativity, in putting friendship and the collective of chosen family at the center. Queer joy is dressing in white and gathering with our people, thousands of us, at the Brooklyn Museum to march for Black lives. Queer joy is understanding that, as artist Micah Bazant wrote on their now famous poster honoring our Black trans foremother, Marsha P. Johnson, there is no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. Something in me resists the idea that we are our own gods, but what is a god but a creator, a source? And what are we, queer people, but the creators of our own lives? I broke out of the prison that I, my family, and institutions had built inside me from infancy through childhood. I chose myself at the crossroads. Learning to choose myself has not been easy. It has upset a lot of people who have historically benefited from my subservience and lack of self-knowledge, but it's true what they say. When you say no, you get to say yes. I have let the no fill my mouth like a sacrament, like Job 38:11. Hitherto shalt thou come, but no further. When the no drops, a gate slamming into the ground, everything that no has made room for becomes clearer. More space, more presence, more love, more mindfulness, less bullshit. In Body Work, the radical power of personal narrative, Melissa Febos calls the power of telling my own story a gospel with the power to cure. The English word gospel comes from the Latin evangelium, which, as any current or former Christian knows, means good news. The healing power of our personal authority is good news indeed. On what would be my 10-year wedding anniversary, I am hosting a pandemic-delayed housewarming in my apartment. My friends bring bottles and bottles of wine. One bakes a vegan chocolate cake, another brings the quintessential Junior's New York cheesecake, and over the course of the evening, the two are mixed together to create an entirely new delicacy. There are offerings of dried lavender, fresh pink cockscomb flowers, bundles of sage wrapped in dried roses, numerous herbs, a nice bottle of bourbon for my girlfriend. Halfway through the evening, a fellow member of my long-running writers group pops a bottle of champagne, the light catching on her signature gold and silver rings, and the whole room erupts in spontaneous cheers and applause. This ignites a conversation about sabering the bottle, and how all my deeply lesbian apartment is missing is a sword. And it turns out that a handful of the queers milling around my kitchen island simply happen to have swords, because of course they do. A quick moment of joking turns into me announcing, well, it is my wedding anniversary, to more applause and whoops and hollers. I'm hosting, constantly scanning the room for empty hands and glasses, walking around pouring freshly uncorked rosé and distributing sweating ice-cold bottles of Topo Chico, refilling the cheese board, putting out forks for dessert, trying to ensure that everyone here has gotten some amount of one-on-one attention. But a few times, I paused to take it all in. People from almost every important part of my life are here, much like tonight. And so many who couldn't make it sent flowers and spices and other sweet gifts, and this feels like a culmination. The gifts, a ceremonial blessing, everyone's presence, a ritual way opening. Having so many people I care about in one place, talking, laughing, finding points of connection, this kind of togetherness is all I ever wanted. I look around and I know, whatever home is, I have found it. Coming out and leaving the church was a death of an identity, a worldview, everything I thought I had known about myself. Like so many queer people before me, I lost friendships, family, community. But there is a secret that the church does not want those of us who have left to remember. There is a love that is as strong as death, the love you discover for yourself when, as Audre Lorde once wrote, you define yourself for yourself. I buried my old self years ago. Do not look for her. She is not there. This is the truth about queer people. We have resurrected ourselves. We are born again. Our tombs are empty. We are risen.
gorgeous, and I definitely want to bring us all the way back to the queer joy, but we might have to follow your trajectory a little bit through what came before it. You know, this book is really, it's so beautifully written, it's so plain spoken, so very accessible, and so brilliant, so smart. And one thing that I particularly love about it is that, like another book that I love, Boy Erased, it really evokes what it's like to belong to the church and feel that sense of community, so that for people who are standing outside it, who've never known that experience, you give them a window in, and I think that's really important. So for anybody here who knows your work from some other context or is here because they want to try to understand, can you just sort of break that down a little bit? I mean, obviously, you're all going to buy the book, but can you, just for purposes of our conversation, can you break that down a little bit, that feeling of community and love and belonging that you once felt in the church?
Absolutely. I mean, belonging is, I think, what we're wired for, right? Like, human beings we are social creatures. I think Brene Brown says we are feeling creatures that think. And that frame has actually, I think, been really helpful for me, particularly in thinking about how essential, love and relationships are. Because one of the, as you bring up, Maud, one of the major themes of the book with mourning the loss of faith isn't just mourning that individual sense of relationship with Jesus and that individual grief over religion or whatnot. It's mourning the community. It's mourning the people. And I think anyone who has ever lost, obviously for me the context was a very strict and fundamentalist form of religion, but I think that anyone who has ever had that enduring experience of losing a wholesale group of people in your life, a family, just a friend group, being exiled from a friend group in high school, right? One of those just really early experiences of bullying or shunning, just that totalizing, one day it's there and the next day it's just out. That kind of excision is so fundamentally scarring and is so fundamentally forces you to rewire and rethink your identity, your purpose, how you relate to others. So for me in the church, I'm sorry, Mercury in Sagittarius, and I'm Midwestern, so we're going to have a few very rambly answers here. But in terms of the community with the church, it's especially, I think, lots of these kinds of communities and those experiences of shunning can be very damaging in a lot of ways, but for folks who are leaving evangelical Christianity or who have left other, far-right forms of religion, like right now in New York locally, we're seeing a lot of folks who have left Hasidim come forth publicly about their experiences of exile. And I think that the specific piece there is that it's not just that the community quote unquote agrees, culturally speaking, on a few values. This is an ethical and moral imperative that everyone has signed on to. The stakes are extraordinarily high because what the stakes that everyone has agreed to are people's immortal soul and what you have to do which is funny, but also very serious. The stakes are heaven and hell. The stakes are of this world and the next. And I think it can sound very hyperbolic to folks who are outside of it, but it is, both of us grew up in it. Your mom, you write about in Ancestor Trouble, your mom started a church in your living room. When you're inside of that world, it is all that matters. And the secular world is secondary. It's so secondary. I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but those are some of my thoughts on community and why it fucking matters. And also why the loss is really damaging. So,
Yeah, I think you did. And I don't think you were rambling.
Sorry, I'm gonna apologize. Y'all, with book straws, I have been apologizing, I feel like I did so much work on myself, and I was like, oh, I got so much better at not apologizing for every thought I have. And like this last 2 months, we've regressed. We've had a regression. So
You've just done my own favorite thing to do, which is apologizing for apologizing.
Like I was saying.
So, it's like Olympic level here. But
I have a feeling there are some other folks in the room.
So, yeah, I mean, one really interesting thing that comes up again and again in the book is all the rules that you have to follow to stay in this community that's ostensibly a community of love and acceptance. Your parents, for example, at one point discovered that the church has been keeping like a Mean Girls book on your family.
Except really.
Right. Yeah. And, you are a teenage girl hanging out with all the other teenagers, having a good time. And yet, because you're curvy, you're constantly pulled aside and told that the same shirts that other girls your age are wearing are inappropriate, that they're immodest. So maybe let's start with maybe that aspect of it, the purity culture, and the box that women and girls are put into this idea of biblical womanhood and how impossible that box is.
Yeah, so I think with purity culture, if that's a phrase that any of y'all are familiar with, it's really interesting in particular because the rules of purity culture, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, really incepted into popular culture and into like our middle schools and high schools and into like school dress codes in a way that really impacted like probably most everyone in this room, even if you have never stepped foot in a church in your life. Like those rules about women's modesty and not tempting your brothers to sin and that kind of language like that I got in church and that other girls like in my youth group got in church was then, extracurricularly, if you will, applied by the evangelical parents to school dress codes, to abstinence-only to pushing abstinence-only education. And so purity culture and these ideas around no sex before marriage and women's bodies are inherently evil and tempting, in evangelicalism, it's a gender binary. There's no spaciousness for gender expansiveness whatsoever. Like if you have a particular kind of body, you're tempting your brothers, etc. The way that it's so remarkable to me in hindsight how what to me were very localized experiences, very personal experiences, actually were being very deeply felt, kind of no matter who you were or where you lived across the US. What has also been more telling with the gift of hindsight and also really unpacking my own whiteness is the extent to which these are particularly within purity culture, an emphasis on white women's purity and an emphasis on standards of specifically preserving white women's virginity and the extent to which that then punishes inherently any person who falls outside of that particular category. So those standards are then going to come down even harder on women of color and or on trans women. Those standards are just then going to be applied that much more harshly. The penalties are going to be so much more harsh, even within a church. And then it just ripples out, schools and so on and so forth. But when you're in, when I was a 13-year-old girl, in the church, what I knew, all I knew was that I was getting pulled aside by church elders and told my clothing was inappropriate. And that just made me want to curl up inside myself and, die and be invisible and do anything I could to not attract attention, even though it seemed that nothing I did was sufficient to not attract attention. And then ironically enough, you're still supposed to somehow attract a boy's attention to marry you, is the end piece of that. It's be invisible, but not so invisible that you fail at the project of biblical womanhood, which is ultimately having to get a man so that you can pump out some babies for the church. Like, go forth and multiply. That is the directive. So it's a very, you can see the problem with these lessons that they're giving. It's a very, I mean, the not having sex with boys before marriage was very easy for me, for what are in hindsight obvious reasons. But it was definitely still, like, the body stuff. The body stuff has been enduring and difficult, and that's something I hear from many, many other people. You know, even if some things are like, oh, well, obviously that's fine, but like purity culture has damning influences, and you really, like, the thing I super want to stress and that I really spend a lot of time in chapter 3 unpacking is, like, you do not have to ever have stepped foot in a church for it to have had an enormous impact on your life and on the lives of people you love, you know, even if you weren't someone who those things were being applied to.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck in the book by how you write about how you were so committed to Jesus and fitting in this frame that you really became divorced from your own desires, your own body, you know, and you sort of felt that if you could be spiritual enough, then none of that would matter. And you know, another thing that you write about so beautifully is the problem of being a smart person in that environment, which is not a diss. You know, there are a lot of smart people who are in the church, but I mean, someone who is intellectually oriented, who had a lot of questions, who really wanted to engage with the Bible and the theology in ways that, as you write about it, were encouraged until suddenly they were not encouraged, particularly because you were a woman.
Exactly. I think that I go really hard on the very condescending attitude that people who are religious aren't smart. It's flat out bullshit. I don't know how you can look at the last 10 years in this country and possibly hold that opinion. People who are religious are, I mean, sure, some of the religion is the opioid of the masses, whatever, Marx, sure. Like, you know, if you want to, like, of course there are people who are religious who aren't smart. There are people I was in college with who aren't smart. Like, sure. Yeah. But
and QAnon is a secular phenomenon as well as a religious one.
Exactly. But to me, I think the issue within the church is that it completely matters what your positionality is. If you're a man in the church, especially if you're a white man in the church, you can absolutely be smart. Like, that's not a problem. You can ask all the questions you want. You can do whatever you want. Like, it's designed to work for you. If you're a woman and you ask questions, that's where we have problems. Like, the fact that it had everything to do with my gender. Everything to do with my gender. Like, it would have been, again, infinitely worse, like, adding on other positionalities. Like, but it was entirely to do with the fact that my role within an evangelical church was to be subservient, shut up, don't ask questions, get married, he makes all the choices, end of story. And anything I do is with his permission. Like, that was actually the issue. Like, my ex-husband also, like, wanted to be a professor. That wasn't a problem. Like, it was a mission field for him. For me, it was entirely contingent on having his say-so. Like...
Yeah, and that's another thing that I really wanted to talk about, how when the two of you got together, you know, you were really sort of, you know, on the one hand you were kind of excited because within this framework, he was a pastor's son, you know, it was very flattering that he was interested in you, and he seemed to value your intelligence, and he told you repeatedly in the beginning, oh yeah, you know, I do want you to speak your mind. And then that changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're in that kind of framework, you know, that kind of conservative, like far-right framework, and you're trying to survive in it, which I was doing, because I was a women's studies major in college, and I led the women's Bible study. Like, there were signs, but I was really trying to make it work. I was trying to, trying to do that thing where you work it from the inside, which just I now don't believe is possible, and within really like any oppressive system. And I was trying to do that really hard. And here along came this guy who had a lot of credentials. He was a PK, like he was really, he wanted to do the same things that I did. And he basically said I could do whatever the fuck I wanted. And I was like, great, I will snag you, like lock you down, like I will marry you. It doesn't matter, doesn't matter that I'm not super attracted to you. That's fine, that'll come, the Bible says so. We will just arrange this, because every other guy in the periphery who had the faith values that I, needed, was going to be much more stringent with me. And so someone who was promising expansiveness and who was promising, oh, I love your ambition. I think even outside the church, that sounds really nice. That sounds like, oh, a guy who's like, oh, I love that you're so smart. I love that you're so ambitious. That, I hear that story from friends all the time here. That's not exclusive to evangelicalism. That's a very alluring promise. I just married the one. That's the thing, yeah. But as you say, then it changed, and pretty much after we got married, part of it was that I had gotten to grad school and he didn't. Don't need to say anything else. And so there's a lot there that I choose not to unpack in the book, that I won't unpack here, but we could just let it lie out in front of us and think about what that could be. And things took a turn after that. And he became less and less okay with the ambition, and less okay with how much space my accomplishments took up, and my ambitions took up, and my work schedule took up, because any of y'all who've been in a PhD program know how demanding that shit is. It became an issue.
Yeah, and he, increasingly treated you with less and less affection or even basic respect.
Yeah, I think that what all of us in this room would qualify as basic respect is not required within evangelical Christianity, which is a feature, not a bug, and which is very visible from the outside looking in. And I think we see it in like you and I have discussed this at length. But I think we see it in all the laws getting passed right now, in the overturning of Roe, feature, not a bug. That's a key, a lack of women's autonomy is a feature of the faith. We don't have autonomy over our own bodies. That's not something that you're supposed to have or even want. So, but whereas I think folks in this room would be yes, if you are a person in this room living, breathing, you have autonomy over what happens to you. What happens between you and your doctor is your business. The state has no bit. That's not how the church sees it. So I think the definition of what constitutes basic respect in a relationship is up for grabs, which pings as abusive probably to a lot of us now. Yeah.
Yeah. There definitely were instances of abuse that you write about. And, I think you evoke so beautifully this sort of existential dread, is what you called it, when you would look at your wedding ring. And particularly that became the case as you became friends with a woman who really brought your queerness alive for you, and or enabled you to find it for yourself, maybe I should say. And then at the same time, that's really beautifully laid against these alternate realities that you're imagining for yourself as you go through. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that time, about what that awakening was like for you, and how you were experiencing both that moment and looking back on, on the path that had taken you to where you were.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, I think, for those of us who didn't grow up knowing that we were queer, who have that like revelation perhaps a little later. At the time I was like, oh, I'm coming out so late because I was in Boston and I was in my mid-20s and all my friends who were queer had been out like their whole lives, and I was 25 and I was like, oh, I'm so aged. And now I'm like, I'm fine. But yeah, at the time, it was so strange because I do remember there was a very specific moment, not when I so much it led to realizing I was queer, but it was more that I realized I was in love with this friend, which I write about in the book. And I remember it was like, I don't even know what the right metaphor is. I'm not that good with metaphors, but like, I don't know. It was like puzzle pieces snapping into place. It was just like sometimes you just have a realization and everything clicks for you. And I realized I was in love with this friend, and I was like, oh, like that's what's been missing this whole time. And it was like seeing my life flash. It's like when they say, right before you die, you see your life flash before your eyes. And that's what it felt like. It's like I saw all of these previous friendships with women that had been so intense and so much jealousy and all this stuff. And I just saw it like all flash, but it was all kind of like I died, right? It was kind of, because it is kind of like you die and then you are new. And then you are like, not to do the born again thing again, but like, because that's the same joke twice. But it's like, I am like this, there is a before and an after. There's no going back. And it is like you see yourself in a completely different way. And I'm like, oh, everything makes sense now. And I remember feeling complete relief in that moment. It was just total relief and total like self-acceptance, except then I remembered that I was married. And I literally had forgotten, no, for real, I had literally forgotten in that moment that I was married, because the feeling of like just total peace was so profound. And then I looked down and I see this wedding ring and I was like, shit. And it all happened so fast. Like I'm telling it now and it's like a story, but it was just like boom, boom, boom. And it was like the highest high followed by the lowest low. And it was devastating because I was like, I've already made this choice and at the time I was still a Christian and I still had this faith. And I was like, there's like no way out. Like I'm stuck with this guy and there's no way out for me. And it was very, and with that chapter, what I choose to do with the alternate timelines, with playing with those, I don't know, I don't play a lot with what if questions in my life these days because I'm really happy with where my life is now. And I'm really happy with the choices that I've made at this point. But at that time, I was having so many what ifs. And I really wanted to find a way to represent that because I think that's also so, not even just for queer people, like for everybody, like, the what ifs, like, what if I'd stayed with that person? What if I'd broken up with that person earlier? Like, what if, my parents had lived somewhere else? What if we'd had more money? Like, what if X, Y, or Z? Like, how would my life have been different? Like, how systemically, structurally would my life have been profoundly different? And I wanted to play with that a lot. And that chapter gave me the opportunity to do so, which was really cathartic, actually.
Yeah, I feel like as a reader, it was cathartic for me also. And
great.
And yeah, and one thing that you also evoke so poignantly is, again, that peace that you felt, that sudden self-recognition, then of course laid against what you described, the awareness like, oh right, I'm married to this person. But then as you found your way out of the marriage, you found that the people you had thought were your community were not your community at all. And so can you talk a little bit about that shift for you in what community began to mean?
Yeah, and it's so interesting because like even hearing you ask that question, it's like when I started working on the book, I think I still had slivers of guilt about my marriage even, and that I was dealing with. And I still had all of these wrapped up feelings about this person who, I'd had that weird relationship with. But now on the other end of the book, I had like the grief that I deal with is for that community. Like that's what, it's like, oh, my ex-husband, whatever. Oh, this other, this woman I was in love with, may she rest in peace. She's not dead, but like, but bless, like bless. But like the people, like who were my people, and like my best friends, like who just dipped and like we're out, I came out to them and they were like, nope. And I told them I was getting divorced and they were like, you're making a mistake. Nope, this is not godly. And they just cut me off. And that is what I still have grief for, I think. Even though I know those aren't people who I would want to be in my life now, there's still a lot, I think, there that I feel for. And I think it's so interesting because the community I have now, that community was predicated on, I think the major difference is that the reason that those folks, snip snip, was because it would reflect badly on them to still be with me because of the faith and because of Jesus and because of the Bible, and they were in churches where they cannot be in relationship with someone who is a lesbian who has left her husband. No, they cannot be seen with me. They cannot be close to me. They they can't, bad apple, they can't be near me. I'll infect the whole bunch or something. But that's entirely reliant on external people telling them what to do and who they can be close to and whatnot. Whereas the people who I'm in relationship now honor their own integrity and make those decisions based on their own ethic and aren't really trying to rely on society's rules or the stigma of church or the stigma of, just culturally, what's in or out or whatnot. I don't really have a good way to say that, but y'all know what I mean. It's people who are no, I fuck with you. And because I fuck with you, you're one of my people. End of story. I go to bat for you. This doesn't change just because the tides turn against who you are, or because legally things change, and because things get hot for a minute or longer. People who I'm in community with now have profound integrity in a way that no institution could ever dictate what they do. That's a lot of you in this room, so I'm just so grateful. And so to me, that's a really big difference. And I think that really speaks to how much institutional conformity doesn't encourage the development of personal integrity and doesn't encourage the development of, I don't want to say thinking for yourself, I think that's too perhaps trite a way to say it, but of really ensuring that doesn't develop personal integrity. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on this lightly, you and I both, have had very, very difficult relationships with many members of our family. And I know we both take refuge in the love and acceptance of a sibling. But, that I didn't want to,
You can.
Okay, well, yeah, so Jeanna's sister is here and is wonderful. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that people outside the church often don't fully understand, the pain of that separation from family, and the ways in which family will turn that lens of judgment on you, and so you're the bad apple and you're the one who needs to be fixed. And one thing I really love in the book that I was so impressed with, just as I shift a little bit into your wonderful sort of I think one of the ways that we're kin is that we're both kind of nerdy.
I'm literally wearing a D&D shirt to my book launch, so
And I really admired the hybridity of the book, the ways that you touched on history and popular culture and politics while still maintaining this amazing momentum. And I think you dispensed with the difference between evangelicalism and fundamentalism in 2 sentences or 3. That was very impressive to me. But, and I think that you accurately describe how evangelical Christianity is sort of the lingua franca of our whole culture right now. In a lot of ways, and how it's been secularized and weaponized. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I am so struck every time I see how integral Christian metaphor, Christian story, much of which is Jewish metaphor and Jewish story, but if we're talking about the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, but so much of it is just braided through leaders' speeches. So much of it is braided through our politics and through just wildly through our literature, everything. I don't know how folks move through the world without having a basic understanding of the Bible, which is a very wild thing to say, I know, but I think once you have even the slightest understanding of what some of the big Bible stories are and the general outline of Jesus's stuff, you see it everywhere. I think of, when January 6th happened, I remember a lot about that day, but also watching, if we all remember, kind of after things settled for the night and the House reconvened, Congress reconvened, and the House, met again, before all of the, posturing speeches started on the floor, Nancy Pelosi opened with a word of prayer. Nancy Pelosi, longtime, House Democrat, from the fucking Bay, from the Bay, not a conservative district, opens with a prayer to a Christian God on the floor of the House. And then all of these different politicians from, different districts all over the country got up, and all of them were invoking the metaphor of Scripture. All of them were talking about shepherds and sheep and, the city on the hill, and all of these that are, if you know what you're listening to, it's Jesus language. And it's for a very specific audience. And it was obviously what happened that day was incredibly horrific, but that piqued me to a new level of distress, was seeing that in the wake of everything that occurred, but it also wasn't surprising, I guess, which was what our, leaders returned to, was this evangelical language. And it's just it's everywhere. It's braided in everything. And I think that's partly why I really struggle out here. I know that that's a big generalization to say out here. I've lived out here for 10 years now, but is also in so many conversations I have with folks who are like, well, we don't know how Roe got overturned. We don't X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, how? It's been happening. It's been here. I don't know. I have a lot of frustration with that. So not eloquent, but yeah.
Well, we're on the same page for sure. And so it's time for me to take your questions. So if you raise your hand, if you have a question, or if you want to just walk up a little bit, I can bring the mic to you so you can ask Jeanna your questions. Come on, don't be shy. Well, I have a whole page here, so that we didn't even get to. So I will ask you one more. Oh yeah, Jessie.
Hi. Thank you for this book. Do I really need to speak in the microphone?
I just want you to for the people who are.
So I noticed in your newsletter that you said Heretic is a triple Scorpio.
It is.
And I wish you would say
I knew this was going to happen.
I wish you would say a little bit about that as a double Scorpio.
Oh, thank you for that question. Thank you for subscribing. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's Scorpio season, and it's an eclipse today, so thank you all for coming out, even if your energy is zapped. And yeah, when I saw that chart for the book, I chose not to freak out, and rather just chose to kind of rock with it, given that there's actually really not any astrology in the book. Also, just spoiler, lots of not lots, a fair bit of tarot, no astrology. All the astrology got cut, but it'll be in a later one. Don't worry. But I really do see a really key thing. I don't know. Scorpio gets so associated, and I'm sure you know this, being a double Scorpio, with like, oh, it's like, oh, the sexy sign, oh, blah, like all this other shit. I don't know. As with all water signs deal with a lot of projection, but I think Scorpio being fixed water, like in the other people project shit onto you. But Scorpio being fixed water, just I think the archetype of Scorpio people who have a lot of that energy deals so much with like what society, like what people project their shit onto. And as a society, as we've discussed purity culture, all of the puritanical bullshit that we go way back into in this book right here, like this country is not okay with sex. And this country has a lot of shame about sex and a lot of shame about bodies and a lot of shame about what certain bodies are able to do. And so I think it's not surprising that, and the US dominates so much of the astrology conversation, just so much of it. So like a lot of what the writing you read about this is from American astrologers writing for an American audience. So this is not necessarily true if you read stuff from people who are writing internationally, but American astrology stuff, when you read about Scorpio, it's like, oh, sex and the taboo. It's like Scorpio is about what we're dealing with that we're too ashamed to talk about. And it's what we're dealing with when we are like really in the muck of transformation. And so I hope that the book can provide that for people, is my take on that.
And I retract my suggestion that you have to stand up. You can just ask the question and I will rephrase it for the people on the camera, because that is actually a little nuts.
I appreciate you.
Yeah. And you know, that's something Jeanna and I have in common. We're both like nerds, but also spiritual seekers, kind of.
It's how
so-
we first met.
I know.
Like, it's the best.
Yes. We didn't get to talk about that, but another time. So more questions, please.
Mindy?
I have a question regarding the writing process. I've obviously read so much of your writing, like academic writing and essays that have to do with like culture and academia, and this is obviously weaving your personal story within that. And I'm so curious about if your mining process and research process, how that shifted and how that was for you.
That is a really, really great question. So Mindy's asking about my writing process being like partly academic, partly personal. Did things shift? How was it? So my writing process, I will say academic writing is my default. Academic is easy, not like easy because like research isn't easy and like theoretical writing isn't easy, but that's comfortable. I lived there for a really long time, and that's really like toggling into that voice is like, oh yes, home, easy. Like getting really vulnerable is really hard, as any memoirist and personal like narrative writer in the crowd can attest to. And actually probably the hardest part about weaving them together was matching the register in tone, if that makes sense. Because as anyone who has read some of like my work before knows, it's like academic writing can be up here with like very, no personal voice and like very theory heavy, and then personal writing is over here, its own craft structure, but like obviously like really vulnerable. And toggling between those two for a while, which my editor Jenny can attest to, it was like very academic, and now we're personal and trauma, and now we're being like talking about Foucault, and now we're talking about how you feel about Iowa, like, and it was like finding which is a critique that my writers group has been giving me for years. And so like finding the space between that and like how to kind of sand down those edges was really hard. I don't know if I think I have gotten better. I think I still have a ways to go at getting better at that, though. Yeah, but that's a really good question.
You did.
Thank you. That's my writing group. Cheers for my writing group. Fucking rock stars.
More questions for Jeanna?
Yeah, Jesse.
What made you decide to finally tell this story?
That's a great question. This is gonna sound like so awful because it didn't really feel like a choice. Some stories I think just hit you in the body, and for me I got the idea for the title before anything else, which has never happened before, and I don't think will ever happen after. But like, I just got the idea for writing a book about all of this called Heretic, and it just hit me, and I was like, oh, well, I'm just gonna do that. And then it was a few years after that before I actually had a manuscript, but once the title hit me, it was like, oh, I have to write this. And there was just such an urgency to it, and I never really let go of it. And I certainly at some points like questioned there was a lot of sifting of what was in the book and what wasn't in the book. And there are many, many things I have written over the years that ultimately weren't in the book. Like those of y'all who have known me for a really long time, Blue Stockings, the lingerie store I owned, not in the book at all. Like, you know, so there are definitely things that I like from my personal life that I have exiled, like, you know, wrote about for a while, ultimately decided it didn't serve the book. But the urgency of telling a story about just the overall experience of leaving the church always felt necessary, I think in part because I wanted to write the roadmap that I didn't have.
Yeah, it looks like there are a couple questions in the back, in the black mask.
Hi, my name's Maddie. I was coming of age, like right around the time of abstinence-only sex ed. I grew up in North Carolina, like a block from my Episcopal church, and I was absolutely like hypnotized by the Twilight Saga at the time.
Oh my gosh.
At the same time, it was like all of my crushes like were wearing purity rings, and like the Jonas Brothers were, and it was just like Britney Spears was being taken down.
Yeah.
It was a really formative time, and I do feel like we're having a cultural reckoning with a lot of that right now.
Yeah.
Especially Twilight, like reading, like a Mormon wrote it, and the whole thing is a metaphor for abstinence.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear just about your, I'll talk about it later too. But I would love to hear more about what you think pop culture, like how it was at the time, like what other examples you can think of from that time period being so intimately involved with the church, and kind of similar references that we're still trying to unpack today.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely get into that a little bit in the book. The Jonas Brothers are a great example. I mean, they recently joked with, not so recently, I guess. It was like a year ago, maybe. But they had a carpool karaoke ride with the awful James Corden. But they joked about, like, who took their ring off first. Like, you know, which is something that, which, like, in context, like, funny, sure, purity rings, ridiculous. But that's something that Jessica Simpson could never have done. And I think a lot, these days, I think so much about, I spend too much time thinking about Jessica Simpson. Like, given that I didn't actually really listen to her music, and I'm not even that big a fan, but she was of that kind of group, right? That little, like, foursome of, you know, Brittany, Christina, Mandy, and Jessica. Like, they were that clique of, like, they kind of rose to prominence at the same time. They were held to ridiculous standards. There was also Destiny's Child happening and Beyonce, and that was a whole, like, different set of standards that they were getting held to. But like this group of like 4 white girls, among them like a pastor's daughter who very publicly pledged to save herself for marriage, very publicly wore a purity ring, and was absolutely like, I don't know that I want to say crucified for it, but like really ripped apart by the media, and then really ripped apart by her ex-husband after they got divorced. Like I think a lot about like those pop stars around that time and how they, and obviously we're witnessing like the post-conservatorship, like Britney, and the extent of control exercised over those women. Like, I don't really know that I have an eloquent answer for you, but just the extent that they were held to standards, the extent that they were controlled so viscerally, that the media so brutally like tore them to shreds, and that they like, I don't know, there are just things that they can never do that the Jonas Brothers can easily do. And I think just really kind of says everything. Twilight's a really great example that I don't talk about at all in the book, but that someone should definitely write an essay on. Again, Mormonism, a little bit of a different beast, but still related. Like, Mormonism, JW, like, different, but like, in the family, you know, so.
Do we have time for another? Okay, one more question. Anyone? If yes.
Oh.
This is like, oh.
I can ask her a question later.
Kendra.
That's true, she can.
Kendra.
Obviously, like looking on your past selves without shame can be such a challenge, but that's required to write as beautiful a story as you have. So how did you take care of yourself in order to kind of gaze upon those past selves without shame?
I love you and I love that question. I stayed in therapy while I was writing this book. I have been in therapy for many years, but I was like, you know what I'm not going to do when I start writing a memoir that's reopening all this old shit is I'm not going to stop going. It's like stopping taking your meds once you're feeling better. It's like that's what we don't do. So I stayed in therapy. Obviously friends were amazing, like stayed in community with people. I think writing can be a really solitary process, but having community is everything. Obviously I have a writer's group, but also like reaching out to the people in your life, cannot recommend enough. Get out of the house, leave your house, go for a walk. I will share though one little bit of advice that my therapist did give me throughout the process, because I think, and I work from home, and I think when you work from home or set your own schedule, it can be really hard to turn off, / it can be like, especially when you're writing or are just creating work that's about really personal or really emotional things, it can be really hard to like leave it behind in a way. And I was in I was really like in a messed up place when I was working on certain chapters, not like messed up, but I was just really not okay. And my therapist was like, are you leaving your desk but taking it with you? And I was like, obviously. And she was like, well, maybe just an idea, just a suggestion, take it or leave it. Like far be it for me to tell you what to do. Just like create a ritual to enter and exit your writing space, so that you enter your writing space, you're here, and then you exit it, and when you exit it, you have closed the space. And that helped more than almost anything else, honestly. So that is like my therapist Sophia's gift to everyone who may hear it or already do it. I don't know, but it was very helpful for taking care of myself, because, memoir writing is hard, it turns out. I would also like to invite everyone to drinks. We're gonna go to Barely, horribly titled bar, but it's called Barely Disfigured. It's just it's like 1 block away. Everyone is invited. I'm gonna probably wrap here like around 8:30, but like head on over. They're expecting us. It's a huge backyard. It's like drinks in the back, mocktails. Come on over, drink, celebrate, have fun.
And before you do that, make sure you buy a copy of Heretic. And if you haven't bought one or if you've already bought one for yourself, then go ahead and buy one for your friends and your family and your roommates, because the holidays are coming up and this is a fantastic book. To those of you who are still with us on the live stream, you can get the book using the link in the live stream description. Jeanna will be signing books at the desk in the side door. We ask that you go ahead and line up downstairs so that our staff can start to rearrange the space, but just give her a moment to get settled before you approach her. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, Maud, for